En la Escuela de Educación de la Universidad de Michigan, que honra a aquellos maestros que destacan por su labor docente. Se desempeña también como profesora asociada en el Instituto para la Investigación Social y como profesora afiliada en Estados Unidos. Sus intereses de investigación se centran en las prácticas de lectura y escritura escolares y vernáculas de los jóvenes, y sobre estos temas ha escrito y editado libros y numerosos capítulos y artículos en revistas como Harvard Education Review, Review Research in Education, Read Research Quarterly, Teachers College Report, Journal of Literacy Research, entre otros. Actualmente es editora asociada del Journal of Research in Science Teaching y forma parte de la Academia Nacional de Ciencias y del Comité sobre Aprendizaje del Consejo Nacional de Investigación, ambos de Estados Unidos. Sus intereses de investigación giran en torno a la forma en la que se relacionan la alfabetización disciplinar dentro de la escuela y las alfabetizaciones y textos que experimentan fuera de la escuela. Además, ha estudiado cómo los jóvenes construyen y promulgan la cultura e identidades de sus hogares, escuelas y entornos sociales y culturales. Estas líneas de investigación se inspiran en su práctica profesional docente desde el inicio de su carrera, cuando enseñaba historia, biología y arte dramático en las escuelas secundarias de Colorado y Michigan. Participa en el desarrollo de la alfabetización profesional con los maestros de Detroit y de todo el país. En esta ocasión nos presenta la conferencia titulada Enseñando a los jóvenes a navegar entre discursos, identidades y literacidades a través de la escuela y la vida diaria.
Buenas tardes. Last year in Mexico City, I began my talk by trying to give an introduction in Spanish. And it was an extended briefing, and it did not go well. As Danielle, I see you out there, afterward he told me it was interesting. And so I will not attempt to give this talk in Spanish. I will simply say gracias, muchos gracias, for letting me give the talk in English. It is, trust me, as much for your benefit as for mine. Let me also say that I am so honored and humbled to be here. It's just such an amazing group of people doing amazing work and really caring about the education of people of all ages. I must thank several people. Alma, Carrasco, Renee, Pons Carrillo. Renee, are you out there? I have really nice shoes on. He likes my shoes. And Tete Horta. All three of these people were so wonderful to me in making arrangements, helping me get to Puebla, and really welcoming me with open arms. I also must give a special thanks to mi amiga, Guadalupe Lopez Bonilla, who has been my constant companion, my translator, and my dear, dear friend. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, Carolina Guadalupe. And now for the talk. I think that my ideas mesh very well with Charles Basserman's, and I hope that you'll see those connections and see these as synergistic talks. I'm going to try to include some theory, some research, and some findings, I should say, of my research, and some examples of teaching and learning activities that are drawn from several design research experiments that we're doing currently in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States. And all of my work revolves around this idea of navigating, and I'm going to try to explain that concept as I go throughout the talk. Bear with me. I planned far too much to say in the time allotted, and so I may rush through the talk near the end. I'm trusting that Roland is going to give me the high sign when I go to one. My goals for the talk are to examine the construct of navigating as a way to support student learning, and particularly student literacy learning. I want to examine the relationship between the navigating that young people do in everyday life and the navigating they need to do, but often do not do in school. And I want to consider together how to support school navigations. And I'm going to use the idea of disciplinary literacy, that is, the specific literacy practices and skills necessary for any given discipline, to try to think about that as an avenue for navigating and an important way that we bring young people into the disciplines. I have to make some caveats or provide some framing for you before I go into the navigating concept so that you have a sense of my thinking about literacy. So for me, borrowing from Brian Street, literacy is more than a set of autonomous skills. In other words, it's not simply about being able to decode or encode words. Those are important skills, but they are never independent of the context in which they're situated. So the very ways, the meanings we make, the ways we encode and decode words are shaped by the context in which we are participating. They're shaped by the relationships we have with people. They're shaped by the identities we bring to the act of decoding and encoding, acts of decoding and encoding, and they shape the way people see us. So literacy is really always imbued with power. Learning literacy, then, is more than simply practicing skills or transferring processes from one head into another. Any kind of learning, whether it's literacy or something else, puts people into interaction and into relationships with other people in particular spaces. And I should add, following Bruno Latour, these acts of learning don't just put people into relationships with other people, but also with texts and tools. So all of these are part of a network of learning, and we have to always think about those when we're talking about learning literacy. Now, these interactions that people have, whether it's with text, tools, or other people, have implications for how people make sense of themselves and others, and how they enact identities, how they show people who they are and who they want to be, and how they're identified. Literacy, in particular, shapes those identities, and identities shape the meanings that we make from literate practice. And I've done a fair bit of writing about this, and even looking at my own literacy practices, and thinking about the ways my identities, my multiple identities as mother, as scholar, as daughter, as neighbor, how those ways of being in the world shape the way I make sense of particular pieces of text. Identities also shape access, agency, and achievement. Now, what do I mean by those three words? Access, of course, means what we're allowed to do, where we can go, who we can be with. Agency, I think of as the strategic making and remaking of self. So agency is not necessarily something that's inside me. I don't bring agency to this stage, but I'm allowed to be agentic in a context in which people welcome me, support me, allow me to speak English, and a variety of other kinds of ways that people support each other. So agency is a social and cultural construct, but it is about making myself. And then finally, achievement. When I'm referring to achievement, I mean two kinds of achievement. One is the kind of achievement we think about on tests, taking a test and getting a score. And another kind of achievement is achieving our goals, finding what we want in life. And for me, the identities we are allowed to take up and allowed to enact shape those three pieces of agency. Literacy and identity, then, since they're related, and they're related to access, agency, and achievement, are clearly, for me, tools of power. And also for me, I believe that part of our job as educators is to equip students with tools of power. That it's our responsibility not just to help them build knowledge, but to help them learn how to be powerful people in the world, how to be agents and be agents of change. And for me, being able to navigate and move across multiple spaces is one of those tools. Now, in my conversation with Moje, who is kindly translating for me, he asked me if I would spend just a minute distinguishing between the idea of navigating and navigations, because the words may not translate as clearly unless I make that distinction. Throughout my talk, I'm going to try to use the word navigating, the verb form, to signal that this is a process. It's a movement. It's not something that's static. It's not an end goal, but it's a constant. And when I say navigations, I'm usually only saying it because the wording is very awkward. To talk about teaching navigating is an awkward phrase, and so I talk about teaching navigations. And I talk about them in the plural, so that we're always thinking about the multiple ways that people have to move across many different contexts, relationships, and identities. So now I want to walk you through my arguments about why I think navigating is important. I've made sort of global arguments, but now I'm going to try to talk a bit about where I came to, or how I came to this notion of navigating. So first of all, I think that teaching and learning should be about trying to build learning spaces, to construct learning spaces that teach children and youth not only the skills and practices of various discourse communities they traverse, but how, when, and why to use those skills and practices, and what the consequences are of that use. And that the idea of the consequences are really important. I remember working with a young man when I was at the University of Utah, who told me, I know people don't like the way I dress. He dressed in kind of gang style, street gang style clothing. He said, I know people don't like it, and I don't care. They can change, not me. And that's a powerful sense of agency, but it's also one that could position him in negative ways in various contexts. And so that inspired me to think about how we can help young people understand the consequences of their navigating decisions. We can consider the classroom and other learning spaces to be third spaces or hybrid spaces where navigating is valued and explicitly taught. In my earlier work, I talked a lot about third spaces, and I talked a lot about hybridity. And I've come to believe that it's dangerous to talk about hybridity as if we're making people hybrid. I like to think of the space of a classroom as a hybrid space, a space where many different ways of being, identities, languages, codes, conventions can come together. But I like to think about teaching young people to navigate. So they're moving, and it's a process, and the classroom is a space with a constant that's hybrid. Navigating is related to but distinct from code switching. Navigating depends on the ability to switch linguistic and other codes as one moves across spaces. And it is strategic, planful, and purposeful. And I'm going to give you an example of code switching and try to distinguish it from navigating. Yesterday, Guadalupe called me in my hotel room, and I picked up the phone and said, bueno. And I apparently did it well enough that it triggered for her Spanish, even though she knows that if she speaks rapid Spanish to me, I will look at her in bewilderment. And suddenly, as she started about, maybe 30 seconds into speaking, she stopped, started laughing, and said, "You tricked me." She had just switched codes. It was unconscious. It was a movement that she made without even realizing it. Navigating is a very strategic and planful movement. It's one where we stop and think before we do it. The goal of teaching people navigations becomes one of teaching processes and practices of navigating. So when you're teaching it, it's very explicit and it's very planful. It requires attention not only to basic literacy skills and strategies necessary for reading and writing at basic levels, but also the skills and the awareness necessary for navigating across those various spaces, contexts, and relationships. So it requires moves like a teacher saying, a teacher I studied many years ago, when she was teaching about significant digits in chemistry, she said, in math, it's okay to estimate. Mathematicians estimate all the time. In chemistry, if you estimate, someone might die. She was really making a very clear distinction and really trying to help them navigate so they wouldn't wander off to their mathematics classroom and be not estimating, or they wouldn't be estimating in the chemistry classroom when they were supposed to be figuring to the significant digit. Another reason that I think we really have to think about navigating is that youth navigate all the time. They go across many out-of-school spaces, so they do it without our help. But they've done it, they've learned these navigations over a lifetime, across neighborhoods, relationships, workplaces, nations, and discourse communities. And I wanted here to try to give some examples from my research. And again, I'll ask you to bear with me because you're going to see dense text, because these are quotes from interviews and field notes. These are from young people who were ranging in ages from 12 to 18 from Detroit, Michigan, in the United States. And they're young people who live in a predominantly Latino, predominantly Mexicano, or Mexican-American community. And I wanted to make that point because I didn't want you to think I only use data with kids talking about Mexico because I was giving a talk in Mexico. I wanted you to know that. So here's the first one. This is Pilar. These are all pseudonyms. My work is ethnography, so I collect a lot of verbal data. And this was an instance in which I asked Pilar and a number of other young people I was working with to write an introduction to themselves for an academic journal article I was writing. So they were very much aware of the research that they were part of. And I asked them to introduce themselves the way they would want to be known to people who didn't know them, people who could be reading this all across the world and who didn't know a lot about the community they came from, the kind of people they were. And so it was a data collection moment, and I really did use it, of course, in the article as well. But it was a really wonderful activity because it gave them a true sense, a purpose for actually introducing themselves. And so as you can see here, Pilar is quite strategic in how she introduces herself because she knows that the readers may not know all the different terms that she might prefer to use to introduce herself. So she starts with her preferred mode of address, which was Chicana, and then she explains it, she defines it for the reader, and she then gives an example to prove she's Chicana because she loves what cumbia means. And in the bracketed information is mine because I had to explain this to people who wouldn't necessarily know what the cumbia teams are. And then she proceeds to use a number of different terms to refer to Latinos or to Chicanos. So she uses Hispanics, Latino, Mexican cholos. And remember, she wrote this. Mexico. Mexican, again Mexican, and then at the very end, just in case they didn't get the idea that she really identifies as Mexican or Chicano, she wanted to embrace all Latinos, well not all, sorry, but the ones that she was really familiar with, and having to mention Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans. So she was really making a strategic move for those readers who might not have any idea what it meant to be Latino. If you have time while I'm talking to read the essay, it's quite amusing. She identifies herself in other ways as well. And one, if you haven't figured it out, is that she really likes boys. She loves boys and she loves to be heard. So this was Pilar. This is Giovanna. Giovanna is a very light-skinned Latina. And this is an interview in which one of the interviewers, one of my graduate students, had picked up on something that Giovanna said. Giovanna had said to her, I talk like a white girl. And she then proceeded to explain what that meant, words like whatever and loser. And then she talked about the way she says it, not just the words, the way she's articulating this. And then she talks about where she learns these words. And she actually goes through the channels to try to find these ways to sound like a white girl. That was a strategic move on her part. However, Giovanna didn't like it if people didn't recognize her as Mexican. And so this is an example of Giovanna talking about another instance in which Paco thought she was white, so she said to him, soy mexicana. And then she explained to the interviewer, like, I'm Mexican. When the interviewer said, why do you say it in Spanish? She said, because he wouldn't believe me if I did it. Again, a very strategic move to navigate. She knew that that's what it would take for Paco to believe her because she was so light-skinned and kids were always telling her she was white. And in fact, she was searching TV channels to find ways to talk like she was white. So she was constantly navigating, depending on the context. This is Angel. He is talking about how he uses language to navigate. And this is a very interesting interview in which the interviewer is asking him about language and about using double negatives. And she asks if it matters, and he says, well, if you're in front of someone important, and I love this next part, the interviewer, one of the other interviewers tries to say, you mean like the President of the United States? And Angel corrects her and says, no, the President of Mexico. You know, not the President of the United States I don't care so much about. That was a sort of navigational move as well. But then he goes on to talk about talking in front of his boss, who is, if you look at the end, right here, a white guy. And he says, I have to talk straight to him, like not saying, like not messing up with my language, like speaking bad and stuff. So you can see again, very planful, very thoughtful, very strategic navigation. Here Angel becomes even more strategic, and he talks about how he goes on the internet and looks specifically for Spanish language sites so that he can practice his Spanish writing. So he's navigating in two ways. One is that he's going on the site and really trying to work on his writing on the site, but he's also ensuring that he's maintaining his Spanish because he lives in the United States, and even though he attends a two-way bilingual immersion school where in theory everyone is learning both Spanish and English, he feels he's losing his Spanish. And in particular, he feels he's losing his ability to write in Spanish. So he's very strategically searching for ways to augment his education. And here is probably the most clear evidence of the kind of planfulness that navigating involves. This is a very different kind of navigating on Pilar's part, and again, it involves boys. Pilar says, right at the beginning of the interview, I have a plan. So this was an interview that I conducted right before school started. And she then proceeds to tell me how she's going to dress one way on the first day of school, and then a completely different way on the second day of school. And she says it's because she likes the styles, but in reality, she's trying to navigate across two different groups of students who like two different styles. And she's trying to communicate to them, I'm part of both worlds. I can play, I can roll with either world. I can be cholo, or as they would say, I can be fresa. So I can do either one, and I'm going to show everyone that. So that's the kind of navigating I documented young people doing outside of school. But what I didn't see was them doing that same really powerful navigating in school. I saw them, in fact, giving up at times in school. I saw them not participating. I saw them not taking up the language of schooling. And the problem is that they do have to navigate, and especially at secondary school, which for me I call everything from grade 6 through grade 12.
so about that age range, 12 to 18, in secondary school. And in the U.S., in secondary school, you start moving from classroom to classroom with different teachers. Is that like that in Mexico the same? And so these children, and they're really children, leave elementary schools where they have the same teacher all day, who knows them well, and who moves them from reading class to language class to science to social studies across the day. Same teacher who knows their strengths, who knows their challenges. In secondary school, they suddenly have to move across all of these different spaces, different disciplines, different teachers, different constellations of kids in the room with them. And they have to be powerful, they have to be agentic, and it's really difficult for them. So this kind of navigation, I feel they don't have the support they need, and they don't have that lifetime or 12 years. The 12 years they had to learn how to navigate those other spaces, they don't have the time because they're being judged by those tests and by grades and homework assignments and by people, by teachers, by administrators, by people who look at them, look at their achievement, and label them. And this is a huge problem, and the problem that I'm really trying to address in my work. This is just my representation of what life is like in secondary schools. And believe it or not, I know Danielle was at the talk a couple of years, or last year. This is an improved version of that model, believe it or not. I've been working on this model, and unfortunately, for me, the kind of work I do, when I work on something, it gets more complex and messier and messier and messier. But this is a typical classroom. If I use the pointer, I know you can't read it. If I use the pointer, this is the classroom. This is the teacher in the middle. These are all the different students. And some of the students have another class where they might overlap in the subject area. These are the disciplines that feed those classes, and these are meant to be other classes, but we couldn't fit this all on the page. And inside each of these bubbles, it says communities, ethnicities, families, peer groups, and popular culture. They bring all of this into classrooms, and teachers do too, and they all have to navigate with each other and across all of those different histories of participation they bring with them. It's very difficult work. And yet, it's powerful and exciting if we really harness the power of difference. Difference emerges from struggle. So difference can be a good thing. It really is when we bring these disparate entities together and we start to build something new that we create new ways of being in the world. The emphasis when we think about navigating and difference is on spaces and points of contact rather than on the end product of difference. But navigating difference can be very challenging, and we need to help you learn to navigate with power and agency. So, the concept of navigating acknowledges, this is kind of a summary, acknowledges the roles of space, time, relationships, discourses, and knowledges in how people engage in literary practice or enact identities. It emphasizes processes and practices rather than a stable state of being a certain kind of person. And it helps to build agency. The green didn't come out very well, sorry. Agency is in green. Young people learn to adapt and take responsibility for their learning when we help them learn how to navigate. Explicit attention to navigating across multiple discourse or practice communities provides greater access to more young people. And we have a serious problem in the United States with access. And developing navigational skills builds critical literacy skills for an educated citizenry. And we have a serious problem with our educated citizenry, or lack thereof, in the United States. But that, still begs the question, why navigating the disciplines? Well, disciplines, as experienced in school, are spatially and relationally bound. That's that movement from classroom to classroom. Even though in my own work, disciplines are quite porous. Learning to navigate can support subject matter learning and interdisciplinary thinking. And attention to differences will help to develop meta-level awareness to support the development of independent navigating. So it's our responsibility at the secondary, actually from the moment kids enter school, children enter school. So I would say from preschool on, we should be thinking about how we help young people navigate so that when they leave school, they can navigate on their own. What does any of this have to do with literacy? Circling back. For me, learning a subject matter is not merely about learning the stuff of the disciplines. It's about the processes and practices by which that stuff is produced. And some of the power of knowledge in disciplines comes from being an active part of its production, rather than from merely possessing it. It's not just about how much we know, it's knowing how we know and being able to engage in the production of knowledge. Disciplinary and subject area language codes and text practices are primary sites or tools for navigating them because they're the tools for producing knowledge. That's how we get the knowledge across to each other in disciplines. And if we don't help kids navigate those language codes and text practices and help them understand why we use certain words in certain ways, they'll struggle. They won't be able to navigate. So now I'm going to move to some practices or ways of teaching navigating. And these, again, are going to pull from my design research. So these are projects that we're doing in and across Detroit. They are mainly in history and the natural sciences, because those are my two areas. My degrees are in history and biology. So I have to do what I know. So how is navigating taught? I'm going to suggest 4 phases or 4 dimensions of how to teach navigating. And I very cleverly, I'm patting myself on the back for this, came up with 4 words that start with E. And this morning at breakfast, I learned 2 more. I'm going to introduce those at the end of the talk. Those 4 words are, we need to first make sure that we engage as teachers in the practices for generating and communicating knowledge unique to and shared across a space or a discipline. So if we're biology teachers, we need to be teaching, engaging young people in the practices a biologist would engage in. We rarely do this in our secondary school classrooms. Rarely do it. And as a result, often, I'm looking at Roland here, we were just talking about this earlier, we often see that when our students go to university, they struggle because they haven't engaged in those practices. They're still trying to learn them. We need to start that sooner. We need to elicit and engineer the necessary domain knowledge, skills, and practices for meeting making. We need to help kids build those skills and knowledges because they aren't members of the disciplines. They don't have everything they need to be able to engage in the practices. And it's in the process of eliciting their knowledge and engineering new knowledge that we can help them engage more fully. We need to lead them in examinations of what words, phrases, and symbols mean in a particular subject area or discipline, and perhaps even more important, in the ways that people use language in the discipline. So not just the words, but the ways with words, to our literacy. And then finally, we need to engage them in evaluating why, when, and how the ways are useful, and why, when, and how they are not useful. That's what builds awareness. Of course, these recommendations beg the questions, what are the practices of the disciplines? And one of our challenges, at least in the US, is that many teachers don't know what those practices are because they didn't engage in them themselves. It also asks, what are the valued words, phrases, and symbols in a given subject area or discipline? Again, many teachers don't know those. They know the definitions, but they don't know why they're valued. And then, why are specific practices of a given discipline useful, and when are they not? And again, that's something that we're trying to work on in our teacher preparation, to to really help teachers learn those things. And so the rest of the talk is going to get at that. These are the kinds of things we're teaching our teachers, and then we're trying in classrooms. So first, what does it mean to engage in the practices of the discipline? From our work in analyzing the four main, very broad disciplinary areas that are dominant in U.S. schooling, that would be the social sciences, the natural sciences, the mathematics, and English language arts for us. From our work looking across those different disciplines, we've generated lists of discipline-specific practices, but we've generalized from those lists to these practices that you see here. We think these are practices that all members of disciplines engage in, but how they engage in them differs by the discipline. As an example, you see that the second bullet is gathering and working with data. Well, what data is in history is very different from what data is in biology. In history, you can't look at something under a microscope. Well, you can. You can look at an artifact under a microscope if you really can't see it very well. But you can't then manipulate that thing and study the outcome. So the processes of collecting and analyzing data are very different. Another piece that's really different, we're working on this in our work to look across the disciplines, is this point about problem framing and question posing. And what we found is that in the social sciences and the natural sciences, and to some extent in mathematics, they are largely driven by problems. They're trying to solve problems. The language and literary disciplines, however, are not always driven by problems. They're more often driven by questions or wanting to interpret, by the need to interpret, to express, and to understand. So those are some distinct differences we're trying to work through right now. But the point is that these practices should be things that we see happening in classrooms. And again, I would say from very, very young ages. Every day we should see some form of these practices. And they should look very unique to the particular disciplinary classroom. One thing I want to emphasize, two things I want to emphasize, is that there's no order to these practices. And we were talking about this earlier, Charles Baserman and I were talking about this earlier. How do you put forward a set of practices and then avoid them being taken up in very routinized ways? So we don't want these to become procedures that people follow in a lockstep fashion. We want to think of them as iterative. But I will argue that we are not engaging in disciplinary literacy and disciplinary navigating if, in fact, we don't start by framing problems or asking questions. If our students are not working to solve problems or ask questions, then they are not doing the kind of work of a member of a discipline. Members of disciplines are curious, they want to know, and they have meaning and purpose in their work. Too often in our school classrooms, there's no purpose. Children are simply going through the motions. They're working with text, but they don't know why. So if we are engaged in problem framing and question posing, almost as a starting place, we are not really doing the work of disciplinary literacy and navigation. I would also argue, I don't know how easy it is to see, that if we're not examining and evaluating claims and engaging our students in talking about how did these claims, where did they come from, what practices built them, are they valid, then we're not building that awareness that's necessary for navigating. They won't know why a claim might hold up if I'm studying a piece of literature as literature, but it might not hold up if I'm studying that same piece of literature as a historical text. So they need to understand those distinctions in order to navigate. This is my attempt to ensure that we don't leave thinking that this is a lockstep ordered set, that we don't have to follow these in a particular order. Now, of course, they do go in some sort of order in this diagram. However, you can see that you could almost start anywhere. And as an example, I said problem framing is absolutely critical. But sometimes we might engage in problem framing when someone has communicated knowledge to us. So someone has shared a finding, and as social scientists and natural scientists, mathematicians, linguists, we say to ourselves, that doesn't seem right. I don't agree with that. This is a problem. And then we set out to engage in a new kind of study. And so this really is not an ordered set. It is an iterative and cyclical process. Now, as I said, our students aren't members of the disciplines. They can't simply jump into those practices and perform them proficiently. We have to support them. We have to build their abilities to do that. We have to elicit what they already know and then engineer new, or what I like to call necessary knowledge. And this involves all sorts of practices. One is that we simply need to be doing more reading with our students. And I heard Chuck Baserman talk about this, reading and writing, that we really need to be doing it in classrooms with students. In the U.S., we are on a kind of, it's a very fast-moving train that promotes this thing called close reading. It promotes it to death. And nobody really knows what close reading is, and everybody's talking about close reading for the sake of close reading. And we're really trying to get away from that in our work and to think about why you are reading closely and why you might read closely in one way in history and a different way in mathematics. And so it involves or requires that we do that with students in classrooms. We just don't read enough in our classrooms, and we don't support kids in reading closely. We also need to work with students to discuss and debate the ideas that they engage with in text. We don't do that very well either. I have a 15-year-old daughter who is going into grade 11, and she just started. And last year, she had the most fabulous U.S. history class ever, in which all they did all week was build up, prepare for what they called Big Debate Friday. And all of their reading, so they were reading with a purpose. They always started with a problem like, what were the causes of the Civil War? Why did it really start? Why did this country start fighting, within itself? And they would read actual scholars. They'd work together in class to read them. They'd debate the ideas in mini debates, and then on Friday, they would form debate teams. And it was amazing. She learned so much that now we'll be talking about something at home, and she'll say, well, so-and-so, and she names an historian. She knows this information so well, and she can think and argue critically. That skill came from questioning texts and questioning others. She came to my class, my teacher's class, and she led them in this process of Big Debate Friday. And she said right near the end to all of my students who were going to be teachers, so she's 15, she said, in my class, my teacher doesn't let us finish the debate until everyone has spoken. So I will need to hear from you, and you. And required them to make a claim or make a statement and back it up with evidence. It was so powerful. That agency this child had was amazing. So that kind of work of questioning and engaging in debate and understanding that debate is healthy and good was really powerful. There's a lot of work that we're doing around analyzing data together, looking at the data. So then we engage in, whether it's in history, we might read a primary source. If it's in our science classes, we conduct an investigation. We grow bacteria. We, trying to think of another good example that won't gross you out. We go out and collect water samples from the river and test them, and then we analyze the data. And we work on how do you represent those data? How do you chart them? How do you put them into tables? How do you put them, translate that into written form and make a claim? All of that work is critical to helping them learn how to engage in those practices of the discipline. We engage in lots of writing to respond and to analyze, 2 different kinds of writing, so that sometimes they're responding to someone else's claims, and other times they're responding, or they're writing, to analyze the data they've collected, or to analyze other claims that have been made. And then finally, they're reading each other's writing, and they're evaluating claims. So they're not just reading texts that experts have written, but they're reading each other's texts. One practice that is very powerful in our work, and I've seen this actually in my daughter's learning as well, very recently, is a practice called talking to the text. It's promoted by people who are doing work called reading apprenticeship. And this idea of talking to the text involves taking Post-it notes, the sticky notes, and having to write questions to the text and putting them, and literally my daughter will have 3 to 4 of these little notes on every single page of a novel she's reading or a primary source. It's about getting them to really connect with the text, to support that close reading and prepare them for those debates and the questioning that they're going to do of each other. They also, we're trying to teach them using a set of questions, how the text addresses the problem that they're studying, so that they're always going back to their problem frame. Who wrote the text, so that especially important in history, so they're thinking about, how might there be bias in this text or in this account? Why was it written? What context, for what purpose? How does the text compare with other texts? And what are the warrants for this text? What's the evidence? How is this acceptable or not? Again, drawing attention to when evidence is acceptable in a particular discipline is critical to this navigational work. We also do a lot of work on what we call pressing for understanding. When our students are working with a text, we don't let them just start talking about an idea. They have to actually show us in the text where it says that. And what is beautiful about this is that they realize sometimes it doesn't say it in so many words. Sometimes they have to point to 4 different parts of the text. And then they're starting to realize how they're building meaning across, how they're engaging in a kind of interpretation. So they're going, is Donna Opal back there, they're going from a literal level to a think and search level, and then finally do interpretation through this process of pressing for understanding. But it's our job as teachers to do that pressing. We can't simply give them worksheets and tell them to go home and fill in the blanks on, how they know this in the text, but that we're actually pushing them and asking the questions. We model those questioning skills for them, and we're providing very specific feedback so that they know why that particular response was not complete or was brilliant. And so other students know why the brilliant response was brilliant. That's also navigational work. Now I'm going to, what's my time? 10 minutes. Okay. I'm not going to be able to show you this in great detail, but I wanted to show you an example of the importance of this and how critical it is to do this kind of work. And I know it's almost impossible to read the text that's in blue. This came from a unit we did on immigration law in the United States over the United States history. We situated this in the particular school we did because we know that many of the students themselves are immigrants or live in families with people who have immigrated, and it's very important and powerful and meaningful to them. So the problem framed was the question of are certain groups privileged, valued, or excluded in immigration law in the United States throughout time. And of course, our students had an immediate answer to that. They had an answer based on their own experience. And what we were trying to help them see was the importance of going to the evidence. And again, Chuck Bezerman talked about the importance of having the evidence for something. In this case, these were young people who had very definite stances on immigration, but didn't necessarily have the evidence for it beyond their personal experience. So we were trying to expand their knowledge base and also teach them history and also teach them strong literacy skills. We did a variety of different practices that I can't describe in the time I have left, but at one point we had them reading the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, and we realized they didn't understand the act. They could read the words. We stumbled a bit over certain words. The word alien in the first part of it was a little strange to them because even though they know a lot about immigration, they don't really think of themselves as aliens. And words like, there's a place, let's see if I can find it, here. It says, it uses, well, in the second line from the bottom, it uses the word resident, not as a noun. So it's very confusing to the students because it's of such nationality, resident. It means really like residing in the United States. It was difficult language. So we spent a bit of time on that language. But what we found was that they still didn't understand what was going on with this text. They couldn't analyze it critically because they didn't have the necessary knowledge. We had to frame a problem for them inside a larger problem that we had and ask them, what was the emergency? What is it? Why was it an Emergency Quota Act? What emergency was happening in 1921? Let's all think, what was going on in 1921? And then we had them brainstorm a little bit, and then we provided them some data. We showed them data like this. And when you read these data, some of our students very quickly could go right to what was happening, to the trend. They could see that the number of Italian immigrants and Romanian immigrants was rising, and the number of British and German immigrants was dropping. They could see that very quickly. Not all students could, though. For some students, we had to actually help them see that the way you read this table is to look across, is to go this direction. And of course, we didn't have it in green highlighting, so we simply presented them with the numbers. Not that you can read the green highlighting either, because it's so dark. But we presented them with a table, and we had to teach them how to read the table. Again, that's a kind of navigational skill. We showed them this table as well. Again, we had to teach them how to read it, because in this case, the important direction is in the columns. So the reading act is vertical as opposed to horizontal. We very rarely teach our students to read tables, by the way. We very rarely teach them to read graphs. And these are important skills, especially in the social sciences. If you can't read tables, graphs, and charts, it's very difficult to make sense of data. So we did this work with them, and they still were struggling a bit with why was that an emergency? Why did anyone care that more Italians and more Romanians or Eastern Europeans were coming to the United States in this time period? And so then we showed them images. And the images, and we showed them also images of Western European immigrants, and they very quickly connected to their own experience. They connected to the experience of race. They connected to experiences of poverty, and they were instantly understanding why there was this emergency. And that goes to the larger problem frame that we had set for them. Does U.S. immigration law over time tend to privilege certain groups and marginalize other groups? So this work that we did to build the necessary knowledge was absolutely critical to them being able to make sense of that text. I'll skip this. This is just another kind of act that we did, close readings, getting them to think about, again, a different immigration law, and then the inscription on the base of the Statue of Liberty, and looking across the text to decide whether, in fact, the inscription on the base of the Statue of Liberty was upheld by the laws that were being passed at the same time period. And in fact, if you read it closely, you would see that the law prevents poor people from coming, right? But the inscription says that, this beautiful woman is embracing everyone, regardless of their status. So we had wonderful discussions, and again, it helped to go to the problem that we had set for them. Are these laws equitable? Do they exclude, do they privilege certain people? And do the laws change over time? And the answer, by the way, is yes, they change over time. They just pick different people to exclude. The second practice that we need to engage in is examining disciplinary language and practices. I'll go through these very quickly. It's critical that we say, write, read, and define words and concepts. A really terrible problem in our secondary schools is that we say many words. We almost never put them in print in front of our students, except when we hand them whole texts and expect them to read them. And so one of the things I teach is that we really need to be thoughtful about putting words on the board, on the overhead projector, on our screens, and making sure that students see the word while we're saying it, and that we spend a lot of time engaging with these words and the concepts that undergird those words. We ask them to visualize words and concepts so that those visual images we presented to the students were very powerful for them in making meaning. We ask them to discuss words. Where did this word come from? Let's look it up in the dictionary. What's the etymology of this word? Whose word is this? What country of origin? We really want them to examine words, and we want them to play with words. We want them to use them in their writing, use them in different ways, try to exchange words. So we do a lot of wordplay. We do use many literacy teaching tools that have been around for 50 years. This one is called semantic feature analysis, and what we love about this tool is this is using scientific words that are easily confused. It's a tool that goes to the conceptual level because it asks students to think about the features of the concept, not just memorizing a definition. And I wanted to put this tool and the next one that I'm going to show you in the presentation because I wanted to emphasize that many of the cognitive strategies that we have been using for years are perfectly appropriate to use when engaging in this kind of navigational disciplinary literacy teaching. Some people argue that they're not, that they should be thrown out because they're generic. I argue that we should use these excellent heuristics and protocols and tools, but we have to use them in discipline-specific ways. They have to be meaningful to what we're trying to accomplish, but they're still very, very useful. This is another one. This is called the Freire model. Some of you may be familiar with it. And again, it works at a conceptual level and allows our students to think about what a word is and what a word is not, what it doesn't represent, and engages them in that kind of wordplay. So we try to come up with examples with images and drawings. So we're playing with words constantly. And we also play with how we write, with discourse practice. This is an example from Jim G. I stole it from him because it's short and easy and really drives the point home. Jim argues that a child, in doing a scientific experiment on hornworms and how they grow, might write a statement like this: hornworms sure vary a lot in how they grow. A scientist would probably write something like this: hornworm growth displays a significant amount of variation. And so we try to engage them in thinking about those differences. We put different phrases up, we pull words from, or passages from science texts, from scientific writing, from historical texts, and we compare them with writing in the everyday, the ways that we would write when we're talking with our families and our friends. And we talk about whether it would be acceptable to talk like a scientist with your friends. Or would it be weird? Would you be considered strange if you did that? There's the citation to Jim's work. We need to engage them in evaluating claims and practices, close reading, museum walks, poster sessions, expert visitors, absolutely critical, so that they're learning to examine claims and practices. I'm sorry I don't have time to talk about this, but we actually put this kind of thing in front of them. We go through with them what makes a historical argument historical, what makes a scientific argument scientific, what are the typical representations that you would see. And then, I never get to do this one. I always put this in my talks, and I always run out of time. Never get to go through this. But we take them through an activity where we put it in their everyday interests. So we give them data. These are data. This is the Billboard Top 10 Artists. I just downloaded these this morning. By the way, Lady Gaga was number 6 last year as well at this time. And then we ask them to make an argument using those data. And this is really very important rhetorical work. We ask them to think about making an argument to themselves. They don't need the data. You don't need data when you're making an argument for yourself. You go with what you like, with your personal preference. Then we say make the argument to your grandmother. If their grandmother listens to any of the music on that Billboard Top 10 list, then I want to meet grandma. This would be very unusual. So those data make you relevant to making an argument to grandma. Make an argument to the mayor of the city of Detroit. A very different kind of argument. What would the mayor care about? He's going to be out of office soon, so probably not much. Make an argument to President Obama. Again, different kind of argument. Make an argument to Fox News. How would the argument change? What would you say is the best music? What kind of music should everyone be listening to? So you'll do different things depending on your audience. And that's a way that we try to get them to think about audience, purpose, claims, and practices. In sum, these 4 practices, these are teaching practices that I think we need to build into all of our teaching routines. We need to engage learners with problems and disciplinary practices. We need to elicit and engineer knowledge. We need to examine language and practices. And we need to evaluate claims and practices. And then, thanks to my new friend Silvana Gili, are you here? Raise your hand if you're here. We also need to think about the fact that we can expose children at very young ages to all of these different kinds of practices. They don't have to be 12 or 16 or 24. But we cannot expect them to engage in the practices proficiently. So we should be exposing, but not expecting proficient practice. We should, however, be expecting that we are going to have to support their navigations, support their learning, and help them become really strong agents of change in the world. Thank you.
Pasamos a la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Les han proporcionado unas tarjetas.
Although navigation is tremendously important in developing interdisciplinary thinking, it made me aware of the possible side effects it may have in learning to integrate knowledge. Does navigation involve integration, or is it just a means of adding components to the already difficult task of building one's identity? This is an excellent question, and it's one I grapple with. I would argue two things. One is that we are always navigating. We're always doing this work, and so we have to figure out how to integrate. I came to this belief because of my own struggles to navigate the experience of being a mother and the experience of being an academic. And thinking about, I see you nudging out your face. Having to think about when I should say what to whom. So part of the struggle I have is that my daughter is a dancer, and if anyone wants to see pictures of her, I will. I spend a lot of time with dance moms. I hope you haven't seen the U.S. television show Dance Moms, because that's not what we're like. They're terrible. But I spend a lot of time with people who aren't academics. And they say a lot of things about schooling. They say a lot of things about teachers, about subjects, and about how schools should work. And I struggle when I'm in those conversations with how much I should bring my knowledge, my expertise, such as it is, my experience, to bear on that conversation, and how much I should just keep my mouth shut. Because I really want these people to be my friends. So that is a challenge that I have to grapple with. And so part of the navigational work that I think part of the responsibility we have as teachers, teaching people to navigate across these disciplines and across all sorts of life spaces, is teaching them how to do that integration. So that leads to my second point, and that is, it has been my experience that the deeper we go and the more we try to figure out the navigations, the more they learn what are the similarities and what are the differences. So it might be that in my talk I emphasize the differences. So, like the chemistry teacher pointing out, in math you do it this way, in chemistry you do it this way. But there are many similarities as well. And so if we can help our students understand the connections, but also the points of departure, then it's my working theory, at any rate, that they will be more comfortable in those situations in which they're experiencing that conflict. And they won't experience those as contact zones. And it may be more important, they won't open their mouths and say something that might be right or true, but inappropriate in the context of the conversation or the relationship. So that's how I'm trying to think about this question. It's a difficult question. Is there more?
Una siguiente pregunta tiene que ver con ¿cuáles de estas actividades son necesarias cuando se trabaja con estudiantes universitarios?
So the question is, what activities are necessary at the university to, I think, to make this navigational work come to life on the part of teachers? Is that right? Does that sound right? Close? So at our university, now our university has teacher education as part of the university. And I understand that's somewhat different here. So at our university, in our School of Education, we're doing a lot of work on this very thing. So those practices that I shared with you are practices that we work on every single day. Well, we don't meet every single day, but every time we meet, we work on a different set of practices and the different kinds of teaching tools for making those practices come to life. Our teaching students go out into the field from the very moment they enter the School of Education, and so they're expected to practice those practices. And then they're expected to analyze those practices. And we work very closely with their mentor teachers. We've been calling them attending teachers, just like in medicine, where there would be an attending physician working with an intern, and the attending physician is expected to model and to intervene on the practice. And so we have the attending teachers. We're working with them to teach them the practices and then teach them how to intervene with the interns on those practices. So they're constantly, probably to the point where they want to run screaming when they see me coming, but they're constantly working on these practices. The difficult piece that we have is they don't experience those practices of the disciplines in their disciplinary majors, in their science courses, in their history courses, in their mathematics courses, until they get to their upper level. So in their early freshman, lower division experiences, they do a lot of lecture. They sit in an auditorium like this, sometimes bigger. They might have 500 students in the room, and they listen to a lecture about physics. So they don't see the practices. They get knowledge. It's that knowledge transfer model. And so we're trying to work with our College of Literature, Arts, and Sciences to try to change those practices. So one thing we've done is my colleague in history has worked with historians teaching the introductory history courses. And they do what they call a pedagogical lab. And it's another hour after the lecture. The historian then goes through the practice of how he taught the class and how he put together the lecture or the activities. And so it's trying to make them aware of what that historian had to do to build that knowledge to then give the lecture. That's a small step. Another thing that we're doing at our university is that our provost has given a lot of money to give out in grants to people who can change their practice, to university professors who can start. Have you heard of flipping the classroom? You know what flipping the classroom is? So they have the students do all the readings and sort of the prep work at home. And they have lectures that they videotape, and they put that sort of outside of the class. And then they come to class and they engage in investigations, they work with artifacts, they work in small groups. So the provost has given money to give to people to make that happen, in their classes. So he's trying, or she, it was a different provost, was a man, and now is a woman, trying to change the way people teach in those content area majors. So those are two things that I think need to happen. One is in teacher education, but the other is in these content area majors. Because they don't have any motivation to do the things I'm talking about when they've just been sitting in lectures. Does that make sense?
Cerramos con una última pregunta. Algunas de esas actividades aumentan la diseñía de acuerdo con el nivel.
So the question is what has happened with the activities that we've done. Does that sound right? So the person who asked it, does that sound right? So what are our results? What are we seeing? What kind of outcomes have we had? So when we are working in classrooms, we see really powerful outcomes. Again, I'll refer back to Chuck Baserman's talk and his point at the end that it's very difficult to trace an outcome because this work is so complex. It's difficult to say that it was caused by the kind of design experiments that we're doing. But what we do see is students who are getting incredibly engaged, students who are writing more, students who are asking more questions, students who are understanding the text. So we can see that when we go through these practices, the same child who didn't understand that Emergency Quota Act now understands it. One great quote that we have from a student when we were doing follow-up interviews was, we said, did you think that these practices were equitable? These laws were equitable when we started the unit? Did you think that U.S. immigration law was equitable? We didn't say when we started the unit. And her response was, well, I thought it was until I had this whole lesson and you showed me what's behind these texts. So it was really interesting because, again, the students could all read the words. They didn't know what the words meant. They didn't know what was behind them. And so we are seeing that kind of evidence. We're seeing greater engagement, and we're seeing, in the moment of the unit, something very powerful happening. Are the students graduating at higher levels? Are they getting better test scores? Not yet. It isn't instantiated enough in the schools. It's not regular practice by enough teachers to have that kind of powerful impact.
Thank you for the presentation. Bien, si no hay más preguntas, vamos por concluir la sesión. Finalmente hago entrega de la constancia